Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Funding Racial Equity, a call for transformation. My name is Jerry Hawkins. I'm the Executive Director of Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, here with a few of my community friends. We look forward to sharing with you some great information about why funding racial equity is at utmost priority in this time, and a call to action. But first, we want to start with our mission, which is to create a radically inclusive city by addressing race and racism through the TRHC framework, which includes narrative change, relationship building, and equitable policies and practices. We envision a Dallas where no North and South divisions exist in terms of race, wealth, arts, culture, health, safety, education, and opportunity, and that our communities actively, honestly, and openly acknowledge, repair, and heal from its past and present racial inequities. Our TRHT framework includes narrative change, which means that we want to expand what it means to be a citizen. That also includes dispelling myths about race and racism in the entertainment industry, journalism and news media, publishing, school curricula, things like monuments and parks. We also know that we need to build better relationships because we live in segregated communities. We do that through racial healing, including tools like racial healing circles and community healing events. After we change our narrative and build relationships with each other, it's really imperative that we find avenues to do the work. And that includes the transformation pillars: separation, law, and economy. Separation includes things like arts and culture and health. Law includes things like juvenile justice and criminal justice. And economy includes areas like the racial wealth gap and workforce. And this is how we do all of our work. We also start every event off with a land and people acknowledgement. When we do a land and people acknowledgement, we're acknowledging that the land that we are on in the United States is stolen land. This is occupied land in the city of Dallas, in Dallas County. This is the land of the Caddo, the land of the Wichita, the land of the Comanche, and so many other racial groups that have been here for thousands of years, stewarding this land before the first settlers came in the 1800s in this land. We also want to acknowledge that this city and this country was built by stolen labor, built by enslaved Africans who were here and forced against their will to work this land for free for hundreds of years, and that we haven't reckoned with that. And it's really important that we acknowledge that this land is stolen, that this cities that we live in and towns that we live in were built by stolen labor, that it's important to reckon with that and start the healing process. We also want to start with community agreements. Usually in a community space, we would offer time for you all to add community agreements, but because of time, we'll offer them to you. We hope that you listen with your eyes, ears, and heart. We hope that you notice moments of discomfort. If you hear something or feel something that doesn't sit right with you, we hope that you notice it and stay curious. We hope that you get ready to ask us some questions and speak your truth without blame or judgment. This is not about judging anyone or blaming anyone. This is for all of us being together, humanizing our processes and our workplaces, and living and working together. It's also important that we're courageous and that we use I statements. We're not going to speak for our entire community. We're going to make sure that we are speaking for ourselves. The other thing is take care of yourself. It's really important that in this time we take care of ourselves and take care of our community. And the last thing is just to be open to the experience of the session and each other. We've learned through racial healing that being open is an active process, that you have to allow yourself to be changed and transformed by a process. So those are our community agreements. We will refer back to them as we continue. We also want you to share your learnings today. Our Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn are Dallas TRHT. We use the hashtags How We Heal from the National Kellogg Foundation and also Dallas TRHT. We also have Dallas resources at the hashtag DTRHT syllabus. So we'll get started. I want to thank our partners in the front because this is the first step to this work. Racial equity work cannot be done alone. You have to have partners and you have to have collaboration. So I want to thank our partners at the Embry Family Foundation, the Heritage Giving Fund, Texas Instruments Foundation, and Faith in Texas. These community groups and community partners are serious about the work of racial equity, and we really appreciate their partnership. So we'll get started by having a look back at one of our community partners, the Embry Family Foundation, who has been one of the most consistent racial equity funders in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and nationally. They're going to give us a retrospective featuring Diane Hosey and Lauren Embry from the Embry Family Foundation, and they'll be in conversation with Akila Wallace, my sister Akila Wallace from the Heritage Giving Fund. So Diane, Lauren, Akila, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jerry.
Good morning and welcome, Jerry. Thank you. Well, first I want to say thank you to Dallas TRHT for this amazing opportunity to partner with you and to engage in this really important conversation with the Embry Family Foundation. Good morning, Lauren and Diane. It is a pleasure speaking with you. And since we're all eager to jump right into today's discussion, let's get right into it, okay? So I'll start by acknowledging that Dallas has had a problematic history with oppressing Indigenous, Black, and Brown people. And the idea of publicly discussing race seems to be fairly new. However, the Embry Family Foundation is the first, and as Jerry has mentioned, the most consistent North Texas funder of racial equity work. In 2013, you launched Dallas Faces Race, the beginning of a sustainable forum on race in Dallas with nearly 300 community partners. The following year, in 2014, the foundation commissioned research on race in Dallas. And this information was vital to guiding the conversation around racial equity and increasing our understanding of the landscape around race in this city. Additionally, you've been one of very few local philanthropies investing in nonprofits like Faith in Texas, who do racial justice work. So Lauren, first, what initially sparked the foundation's interest in funding racial equity at this level? And why do you think it took other funders so long to join you in this effort? And why is it important for foundations, businesses, giving circles, and individuals to prioritize funding racial equity now more than ever?
Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you today. Thank you so much, Akila, for joining us. The reasoning was really twofold. The first was I had a deep-seated spark about racial equity within me due to my upbringing. I had an African-American woman who, many have heard this story, but I had someone who came into our home at my age of 3 months and was with us until her death in her 80s. And so, you know, someone for 40 years of my life who was a real staple and a real strong force and a pillar and an unconditional loving force for me in my life. And as I walked through the world and noticed the differences in gender that I experienced, I also was cognizant and aware of what I saw happening in her world to a certain degree because I was exposed to her world. And it was either 2008, 2009, I had a revelation at a white privilege workshop that Race Forward did. At that time, they were called the Applied Research Center. And it was a huge aha moment for me, which I've told that story through an op-ed, but it really knocked my socks off. And I thought, how could I have been so ignorant to this all of my life of just these deep-seated structural racial inequities, and as Jerry said, myths about the difference in race, that it was a profound experience, and I knew moving forward that we needed to address this. We weren't exactly sure how. We were delving in a little bit into implicit bias at that time, and that was the time when people were learning more about what implicit bias actually was. It was the beginning of that curve. And so those were the two main reasons that took us down this very committed path of racial equity and justice. I think that it's not easily bridged for people and transferable. I think it requires delving into ourselves. I feel that that's why people have been slower, foundations have been slower again, because it's a commitment of self. It's not just a commitment of giving and funding to others and to organizations and to grassroots leaders, people on the ground, but it's a commitment to delving deeply inside yourself, to look at your own implicit biases, prejudice, look at your power, where it's come from, how you have it. And that is, as Jerry said earlier, it's a deep process and it's not easily done. And you have to be committed to it, and you have to trust it and have faith in it to move through and with it, so that you can become a better human being, which then helps your funding and the world and the way you relate, your relationalities with others on this road. So it's not something that happens quickly. It's not like I'm interested in education or mental health or something that's a bit more abstract, right? Because it's so deeply embedded. It is so mythic that the strands just go in everywhere, and just one leads to another, leads to another. It's not a direct path. And that's what I see, and as the reasoning. And I feel that why it's important now, it's just the time is now. I mean, it is clear, the inequities, unless you're living under a rock, and some choose to, which I'm not trying to judge, but maybe I have a little judgment in my voice. But, the time is now. If we don't do something now, when are we going to do it? I mean, it is just exponentially obvious that the core of all of our troubles is rooted in racial inequities and the injustices that occurred. If we don't fix this, we can't fix anything that we're trying to make better for folks in our community and our nation, et cetera. So that's how I feel about that.
Absolutely, thank you. Diane, did you want to chime in on
Sure, thank you, Lauren. I sit here in gratitude to be at the Embry Family Foundation and to have Lauren Embry leading this organization. I think that's a key component. You have to have someone, a leader, who is willing to step into this and lean into it and put money behind it and be honest and transparent about their own vulnerabilities. And that has allowed Sally, Beck, and myself to also speak to our own truth and fallibilities. I discovered Audre Lorde not necessarily for her poetry and her activism, but because she was a Black woman who had breast cancer, and I'm a breast cancer survivor. And so that's how I found her and read her work and learned about her. And I recently, revisited a quote that she said, and I think it speaks to what Lauren was saying about, now, the nowness. Life is very short, and what we have to do must be done in the now. And there has been urgency for years. And, maybe this is the blinders are maybe more off than they have been. I'm not sure about that. As a 66-year-old white cisgender woman, it has been it's been a journey for me, and it continues to be so. But I'm committed to the learning and to understanding and staying with it and sticking with it. And I do want to offer gratitude too, when you mentioned Dallas Faces Race. And please, I want to invite everyone to visit our website. We have the report on our site, front and center. Read the case studies, look at the videos that are there. We try to be simple, but also include a lot of depth, so that people can explore that. But Dallas Faces Race what came together because of women. And I want to name their names. Rinku Sen, who was the president of Race Forward at the time, was our national partner in the capacity building that we did in Dallas. Lyria Howland, who with Howland PR gathered an amazing team. Camila Collins, Minerva Rodriguez, Cynthia Young, and myself, and we were the core team, and we just said, we don't know what we're doing or what we need to do, but help us move our fog around and keep us honest. And we kept each other honest, and we found ways to build bonds with each other. We had those intimate conversations with each other so that we could be vulnerable with each other. And it made all the difference, I think, in how we moved into the work and continued the work. And you know, through Rinku Sen, we got connected to Dr. Gail Christopher, who we know is the orchestrator and really the Desmond Tutu, I think, of this country when it comes to truth, racial healing, and transformation. So I just have lots of gratitude. And it led us to you, Akilah. So, you know, here we are.
Well, thank you. And I so appreciate both of you and sharing, you know, the journey and what's brought you to being champions for investment, intentional investment, real investment, transformative investment in racial equity organizations. Something you touched on, Diane, around being honest. So for me, you know, when I think about my years when I was working directly in philanthropy, the gaps in racial equity were blatantly clear to me. And I wanted to be honest and true to myself and to my people and to the communities that I knew were not being properly represented by either being considered as a funder themselves, but also in the ways in which grant making was taking place. And so that prompted me to research culturally relevant giving models in other markets, ultimately introducing me to giving circles and inspiring the launch of Heritage Giving Fund, along with my mentors, Doctors Halim Malik Francis and Francois Booker Drew, and 50 other founding members of the Giving Circle. We knew funders weren't using a racial equity lens. Definitely knew gendered lens, you know, was being considered in many predominantly white, women-led philanthropic spaces, but not necessarily this racial equity lens was being used when assessing who was worthy of investment or not. Or worse, the who knows you game was locking out brilliant leaders without the privilege of proximity to decision makers. And so we founded the Giving Circle, led by Black women, committed to funding Black women-led and Black benefiting nonprofits. We were unapologetic in making that the standard. And so today, with our ongoing 50+ members, we have awarded over $100,000 to over 11 Black women-led nonprofits here in North Texas. And I'm love to celebrate the accomplishment that we've been able to do through our personal giving, but our contributions have been vast. But we experienced challenges over the last 4 years due to implicit biases and classism, often associated with others' proximity to power. As white women in philanthropy, how has actual and perceived power benefited you? And how have you used your power for the benefit of oppressed communities? And I'm just gonna throw this out here. I also am interested in, have you ever wrestled with how you show up in the work as an ally and not as a white savior? Sorry, I know that's pretty lowly, but we'd love to hear from you.
Diane, you wanna go first?
Well, I'll start with the last question first, I think. You know, I just mentioned sort of, you know, who I am and where I stand in the world. You know, I think cynically I've referred to sometimes that as white people feel good money. And I have to call myself out on that too, in regards to, I think as an individual and as a funder, we can, you know, because of bias that surround us, like water to the fish, we don't see that what we may be putting ourselves into or putting dollars towards is to satisfy ourselves and make us feel better in some way, and not really being, going for the root cause of what creates these situations and to begin with. And really that was the question we started with Dallas Faces Race is, you fund a lot, but what creates the poverty? What creates the lack of access to education and jobs and dollars and leadership positions? And it's racial injustice. And certainly I have fallen into my own world and my own privilege in that regard. And we have too, as a foundation. And the more you know, the more you can be aware of it and do something about it. And, one time, there's a lot of words about about white allyship. And I love the fact that recently Rinku Sen said, how about friends? How do we create friendships? Because friendships last. And if you create a true friendship in your community, you're creating a commitment to be there with each other and to help each other and support each other. And so I think that that's part of the paradigm shift in many ways is, because a lot of folks are like, I don't understand what we mean by allyship. So I'm just gonna, that's my honest response to that. I am married to a man of color. He's Korean. He immigrated when he was 5 years old over to this country. And I'll be honest to say that my white privilege shows up in our marriage. As intimate as that relationship is, and those are hard conversations and hurtful ones. But, I want to stay committed, and I want to stay, if we want to stay committed to this work, we have to examine and continue to pull ourselves up when we fall into these easy ways of being in the world and working in the world.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to add here about the power piece, perceived and actual, is I think that power and injustices and inequities are so deeply ingrained and embedded in our culture that it is in no way obvious. So I don't know sometimes that I could even say I perceived the power or the actual, because it's through the experience that I realize, it's through the learning of the implicit biases. And as I walk through life and have relationships that I learn about it. I understand it better because I am a woman. And so I understand what I've had to battle with white men for sure, which has been huge. So I get that, and I'm able to move into it more easily and freely and open to it, I feel, because I understand on the gender side what it feels like. But I do think for me to sit here and say perceived and actual, I don't know that I could actually tell you that well, except that I do know in philanthropy, I have been put on an unnecessary pedestal over and over and over again. I have been able to send emails and say, I want to go to this, and let in immediately. I have been granted reward after reward, I will say, simply because I've written a check. Now, I'm not trying to diminish from myself and say that we've done good work and things like that. So I'm really not thinking that, but I'm looking at just the overextension of what I've been allowed and brought into when money is at the core of everything. And we don't live in a society that believes in win-win. I believe in win-win. If you win, I win. If I win, you win. But I must say, I don't believe it all the time. I have to pull myself back in and notice when I'm not, which is actually that power structure affecting me and me liking to be uplifted. I had an aha moment when I went to the Movement for Black Lives funders briefing way back in, maybe not way back, but definitely 2018, 2017, 2018, and to your funding of Black women leaders. I was blown away. It was all Black women leading this funders briefing. I was just blown away by the expertise, the strategy, the charisma, the love, the passion, everything, just the whole package. And I was like, it is not my time anymore. And I've got to be real about that, Akilah, that I was feeling like I was just coming into my own in some ways. A white woman brought up in the South when men's voices, my voice had been diminished, and just trying to get it out, you know, being too blunt sometimes, or maybe too, you know, forward with it just so someone would hear me. I had to wrestle with that a little bit, knowing that this is a transfer that needs to happen, but understanding that my voice is still relevant and in its place, but what is that? So that leads me to, you know, the friendship, the allyship, the being together on this journey, walking side by side, not in front of, not behind, but shoulder to shoulder in this. And for me, the funding, as far as the white savior, it really truly, and I think Diane could say this comes from my heart, all of it. I mean, because of my family story, this is all directly for Ray. It's directly from my heart and for her in some way that she can see on the other side. And but I am still walking, learning, and, you know, building the trust, and listening is just a great practice in life anyway. For me to just be quiet and listen and build trust is just a really great value when you're in this world, based on how you're uplifted and what I've mentioned to that respect. So I think that's it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so we're coming up on our last few minutes, but I definitely want to give an opportunity to just touch on two things really quickly. So one, I'd love to just hear quickly from each of you advice or some sound words to the decision makers who are, still exist, who are still turning a blind eye to blatant racism, discrimination, and systemic racism within businesses, fundraising, philanthropic giving, every layer and fiber of this nation. What do you say to them to invoke them to recognize their responsibility and how they contribute to dismantling these systems, and a very clear call for them to appropriately pay reparations to the community groups that have benefited, that they've benefited from through their intentional genocide, forced labor, mass incarceration, and wealth extraction? And then just to close it out, if one of you would just touch on, you know, because this work is heavy, what brings you joy, and what is the heart and soul of the work for you? So if one of you just would like to just touch on like a very clear call to action in the ways that, like, for those who are turning a blind eye, what do they need to do to change, and lean into being in partnership and being friends with those of us on racial equity on the front lines, and then ultimately, what brings you joy as you continue to lead in this work?
I'll go first in saying that what I felt about the blind eye, is my call to action is for all of us to get out of this world of money, to where the more you have, the more important you are, and clinging and holding and accumulating to such a vast degree that is so unnecessary. So that is my call to action. Humanity, people need to be the most important, not money. And I feel that that's why people show a blind eye. I think some are going to continue to, but that's my call to action. Let's put humanity first. Let's put us as people, the creatures we live with, our earth first before money. That is where we find the love. That is where we find the passion. That's where we find the beloved community. That is where we can all be together and hold hands and make this world a better place. This work has been the greatest joy of my life. And I am so grateful to be in community with all of you and to help share my voice and my story in any way that is helpful. Diane.
Joy.
Well, read the book, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. I would say, I'm just going to shout out that reference right away. If they're elected officials, hold them accountable. And if they're not accountable, you know, organize and vote them out. And so the organizing and the activism and the vote is huge. If it's a corporation and they are bound by shareholders, then, let's, raise your voices. And, if you're within an organization or business, it's not easy, but many of these businesses put statements up, last summer about this time in regards to what they were seeing and hearing. Hold them accountable to what they are saying. They need to put strategies behind those things, and they need to, employees need to find, the courage, and they can organize, there's affinity groups within organizations, hold leadership accountable. I'm a big fan of calling in and not shaming or calling out, but sometimes you just have to do that. And so I think that's part of it. Education is huge. Awareness building is huge. And, but one of the things that the folks at Race Forward said to us, and it's my mantra, work with those who want to work with you. And I think by doing that, you start creating a critical mass. And the critical mass can, be the voices that are most heard, and then it can spread. I think that's the way to go. I'm not going to stop. Gail Christopher said, we don't stop until we're dead, Diane. So I was like, okay.
All right. Well, then let's keep going, ladies. Thank you so much for your courage, your transparency, and the intentionality of your dollars that you have invested in our work. And also, I invite everyone to please, engage with Heritage Giving Fund. You can go to our website at heritagegivingfund.org, learn more about the work that we're doing, and support us by becoming a member or joining us in donating to our causes. So thank you so much. And looks like, I believe we'll be transitioning. Pleasure, ladies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Akilah, Diane, Lauren, for your grace and your courage and honesty. We really appreciate you. As Diane, Lauren, and Akilah mentioned, I will share that resource, which is The Sum of Us. It's a great resource for us. And let me stop sharing my screen and go back to it. The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. Heather McGee was so gracious to feature Dallas TRHT's work in the last chapter of this book. We encourage everyone to get it. And if we have a local partner who doesn't have it and wants it, we can get you a copy. I also want to follow up Embry's discussion by sharing a video. We have a video that Embry Family Foundation in their retrospective did with local community members called Pursuing Racial Justice for Healing and Equity. And I would love for you all to share that, to watch that now as we continue. So let me share the video screen, share sound, and all right.
What makes Embry unique is a level of fearlessness and risk-taking that many of the traditional philanthropies simply will not take.
We created all kind of things just by having a personal connection and then making personal connections to other people.
That relationship with Embry, I think, has personally been life-changing for me.
Chantel is like the first dedicated racial equity staff member in Dallas.
Dallas Faces Race, which is really the hub and the community that has housed all of us together on the call, was fundamental in convening over 200 plus nonprofit organizations across Dallas County to say, what does this work look like internally for your organization? And really to ask them to find their work in the work of racial justice. They have statements now and are showing a vested interest in what racial equity looks like for them. And I like to think that that is because of their investment and their involvement. They gave the social sector, the art sector, the competence and the confidence to speak to racism, and most importantly, what it could look like moving forward.
That work has continued and emerged now through Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation.
I feel like my role now is kind of in the legacy of Chantel. She walks so I can run.
What we learned from Dallas TRHT was Dallas ranks dead last in economic inclusivity. Women of color who lead nonprofits receive 0.6% of philanthropic dollars. So there's a trust issue.
Now, Dr. Gail Christopher will say racial healing is not racial equity. Racial equity is the funding.
You know, there's a need for us to have really meaningful, honest conversations about why those statistics exist.
Embry, as all funding are still gatekeepers, you know what I mean?
You can't always look at an organization and determine their value on paper.
The Embry Family Foundation provided seed funding through what was called a shared giving approach. Leaders from organizations sat in a circle, and we actually cut the pieces of the pie according to our own judgment, which was really an extraordinary experience.
And that kind of radical space where different forms of value are able to make their way into a room and to inform decision-making.
I felt very empowered.
We had the opportunity to actually elevate our values of racial equity. So there was an experience of really feeling emotionally whole as an individual, but also emotionally connected with each person in the circle.
And it was really cool because, you know, I think organizing sometimes can be on a little island, but Embry has definitely been a place for organizing to feel connected to the larger progressive landscape in Dallas County for sure. And that birth stuff, right? It moves from being transactional to being really transformative.
What holds all of these groups together is this understanding of our own self-worth is not measured by the funding that we receive from foundations and individual philanthropists. That our self-worth is who we are, our culture, and our communities. And this was really the thread, I think, that Diane and Lauren were really taking us through.
I remember back in 2016 when Philando Castile was murdered in Minnesota, and there was a handful of us that were trying to figure out, what do we do, right? What do we do in this moment? And so 8 of us took to Highway 75 and stopped traffic with a Black Lives Matter banner. None of us got arrested, but we were prepared to. But when we were debriefing afterwards, we were trying to remember what how did we get here, right? And the majority of us had a connection to Embry, right? Like that's like the kind of like ripple effects of being in community with folks, like what it could, what it leads to, what it can inspire. That was the first time I participated in civil disobedience. I just got a ticket, but I'm ready for more.
To be honest, Embry has been the only consistent funder of racial equity work in the city of Dallas and Dallas County. The courageousness, the multifaceted approach, funding organizing, funding arts.
That process enabled a healing space.
But for Embry, I don't think that I would have, those connections across Texas.
This experience and process with the Embry Family Foundation helped cultivate a community in the resilience for the long march towards racial justice. On the other side, I wish they did more.
We need 5 to 10 Embry Family Foundations.
Because it's starting to feel like there is a rollback of equity strides taking place in Dallas and in our country right now.
I wish folks can do more for our city because we need it. Awesome. It's always great to see our community partners, and I really appreciate the work of the Embry Family Foundation over the years in funding racial equity work. Let's go a little deeper. My friend and colleague Teresa mentioned something in that video, and it was about data. Let's talk about the past, the future, and the present future landscape of funding racial equity. I want to start with a report, and this is a resource for our community. This is Bridge Brand Group's and Echoing Green's Racial Equity and Philanthropy Report. The subtitle reads, Disparities in Funding for Leaders of Color, and leaves impact on the table. And I always use this quote, but this quote is also used in this report. And what it says is, race is the most reliable predictor of life outcomes across several areas, including life expectancy, academic achievement, income, wealth, physical and mental health, and maternal mortality. And what the report continues to say is that developing solutions without a race-based lens will bring you the wrong answer. Dina Hayes Green and Bayard Love from the groundwater approach says, if the socioeconomic difference explain these racial inequities, then controlling for socioeconomic status would eliminate them. But unfortunately, that control does not eliminate them, right? Which means that we need some different type of responses to our biggest problems. In this report, it says two of the biggest factors holding back philanthropy's quest for social change is one, understanding the role of race in the problems philanthropists are trying to solve, as Akila mentioned earlier in the discussion. Two is the significance of race and how philanthropists identify leaders. Akila also mentioned that, and finding solutions. To go a little deeper, the report mentions that there's a racial funding gap that exists between white-led and Black-led early-stage organizations. You can see here from the Echoing Green 2019 applicant pool that there's a $20 million funding gap between white-led organizations in the early stages and Black-led organizations. Continuing on the right, this is something I've definitely experienced, is that 11% of big bets for social change, and we're talking about large funding, between 2010 and 2014 went to organizations led by people of color. So just 11% of that pie, right? Nearly 90% went to white-led organizations. And it says that one organization, and we all remember the Harlem Children's Zone, accounted for 1/3 of that 11%, right? So even less was shared with leaders of color. To make it more plainly, the report also says that on average, the revenues of Black-led organizations are 24% smaller than their white-led counterparts. And it also includes this unrestricted net assets of Black-led organizations are 76% smaller than their white-led counterparts, right? This report also mentions the 4 key barriers to capital faced by leaders of color. What it says is, number one, and Akila mentioned this in our talk with Diane and Laura, getting connected. Leaders of color have inequitable access to social networks that enable connections between the philanthropic community. Our community member and colleague, Dr. Francois Booker-Drew, talks about that connection work all the time. Building rapport. Interpersonal bias can manifest as mistrust and microaggressions, which inhibit relationship building and emotionally burden leaders of color. Lauren talked about that implicit bias work that was early part of the learning. Securing support. Funders often lack understanding of culturally relevant approaches, leading to them to overly rely on specific forms of evaluation, right? We've heard of like best practices, right? Or strategies that are familiar only to them. And then sustaining relationships. Grant renewal processes can be arduous if mistrust remains, and funding may stop if a funder has a white-centric view that defines strategic priorities and progress measurement. And it says, across all stages, repeated interactions with bias can cause leaders to adopt mindsets and behaviors that further limit their fundraising. And the source is from the Bridgebrand Group. To talk about racial equity funding since 2011, and this is from P&D Candid. They have a great website that captures racial equity funding. And they give a summary of who's investing and then who's also pledging to fund racial equity. And what they said since 2011 is that there's about 6,412 funders who are either investing in or pledging. And that pledging is tricky because there's an article just released a few weeks ago that said that a lot of the pledges that came from last year still haven't happened yet. But you can see the total number of recipients are almost the same as the total number of funders, right? So we might have to think about the equity in that. Almost 7,000 recipients. And then the total number of grants and pledges, almost 53,000. And then the total dollar value of grants and pledges, $18 billion since 2011. If you can put that in perspective, educational funding dwarfs that every year. And since 2020, this is a really interesting slide because they also talk about the funding since May 25th of last year. And what they say is George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police. The information below shows funding earmarked for racial equity starting in 2020, which has increased dramatically since Floyd's death and coronavirus pandemic started and sparked the movement. And so since 2020 and updated at June 5th, 2021, there have been 3,236 grants valued at $4.1 billion and 155 pledges valued at $10 billion. And those include things like cash grants, employee volunteer services, in-kind gifts, which we have to be very wary about when we're talking about funding Black-led organizations, and then matching grants. The top funders include JP Morgan Chase, Mackenzie Scott, who we'll talk about in a minute, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, the Ford Foundation, and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. The W.K. Kellogg Foundation provided seed funding for the Dallas TRHT initiative and the TRHT nationwide initiative. And then recipients include organizations like Akila Wallace's other organization, Faith in Texas, who had a great bail fund, was helping folks, deal with, cash bail. Chan Zuckerberg Foundation, Anti-Asian Hate and Violence Groups, and Unidos US. I want to say that racial equity funding is really important to talk about because Mackenzie Scott, one individual, has become the second largest funder for racial equity, which talks about how much we need racial equity funding from our funding partners. Mackenzie Scott's giving priorities, however, relies on the fact that we need money in communities' hands. Her giving has been around racial equity for the most part, and that racial equity funding has been unrestricted. Those community organizations are able to use them as they see fit. The majority of the racial equity funding that she's given out has been to HBCUs, historical Black colleges and universities. But it just belies the fact that one individual funder has become the second largest funder, racial equity funder in the country. We need more racial equity funding. I also want to share this from McKinsey & Company. What they shared was 5 important philanthropic practices to build on during the COVID-19 recovery. And what it says is reduce the burden on grantees. And that's something that Mackenzie Scott has done in her funding, which means continuing granting practices that work well during the pandemic, right? There was a lot of collaboration being done. There's a lot of funding being done on an emergency scale, was given directly to communities, and then joining the discussion, creating more easy applications for organizations to apply to. The next is accelerating the pace and volume of funding, thinking about freeing up capital and considering increasing payout, and also considering if the rate of spend down matches the mission. Next is what I saw some of our philanthropic partners do, which is partner with other donors to go faster. This is something that Embry has done with a lot of local funders, and that is resisting the temptation to start from scratch, to partner with folks and to team up to combine expertise and to drive efficiency. The next strategy is to invest more in local communities. And this is definitely something that we are urging. We want funders to evaluate their amount of local giving, support partners that understand and have roots in the community, and then help organizations that support and are led by people of color. And the last is supporting the public sector, which includes cross-agency work to solve underlying problems, and then helping our government organizations train leaders and attract top talent. And to focus on one of those suggestions, which is investing more in local communities, we wanted to highlight one of our community partners, which is the Texas Instruments Foundation. In 2020, during the racial reckoning and the COVID-19 pandemic, TI and Dallas TRHT, through our partners like Embry and others, formed a relationship with the Texas Instruments Foundation and its leader, Andy Smith. And with a $500,000 2-year investment, Dallas TRHT was instantly able to strategize and grow our organization. We went from 3 employees to 5 over the span of 5 months with this investment, and really appreciate TI's, number one, putting racial equity as a platform strategy on their website. If you go to TI's foundation website, you'll see that pillar for funding, but also the candid investment in time and effort from the entire foundation and Texas Instruments as a whole. We have partnered with their ERG, we have partnered with their communications, operations. And so I want to bring Andy Smith to the discussion with my partner, Erica Flood-Moultrie, to discuss the local funders' role and why are folks like Texas Instruments funding racial equity work. So Andy Smith, welcome. My partner, Erica Flood-Moultrie, welcome. Thank you all for being here. Look forward to hearing more from you all.
Thank you, Jerry. Good morning to everybody. Really excited about this conversation. And actually, the after action from this conversation is even more excited. But I am thankful to be able to have this conversation with Andy Smith, who, yes, is a partner, but also has become a really good colleague and friend in all of this work that we're doing. So good morning, Andy. Good to see you once again.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you. Like Jerry said, we're so appreciative of the support that Texas Instruments provided to Dallas TRHT in such a significant way that actually followed after our Kellogg funding or granting had actually come to an end. And Texas Instruments was radical, right, in supporting us and providing such a significant investment to the work that we were doing. So I want to talk about how Texas Instruments got to that place of one, identifying and taking a stand and having a pillar as a part of the work that you all were doing, right? That's the first thing. Some of the things that we make sure that people do as we do our racial equity now cohort and they start developing their policies is that they're explicit about the work in naming race. And Texas Instruments the Texas Instruments Foundation was explicit in doing that. What got you all to that place?
Well, Eric, it's good to be with you today, and thanks, Jerry, as well. And before I talk about that, Eric, I've got to give a shout out to Lauren and Diane and the great work that the Embry Family Foundation is doing. Lauren and I serve on a board together, and her commitment to this, if you couldn't tell from what she said, is so deep and so real. And she has brought to that organization such passion and such good conversations, and I'm proud to call her a friend. And so thanks, Lauren, for all your work, and Diane. So Erica, it's, the conversations I guess, happened with so many people after George Floyd's murder last year. It wasn't just philanthropic, though, at TI. I want to be real clear about that up front, that our approach on adding racial equity as a pillar is just one of a number of things that happened as a result of that wake-up call on May the 25th of 2020. We were looking at everything, how we're recruiting, talent development. We formed a new diversity and inclusion team within the department that I'm in. Courageous conversations have been had. It's probably one of the most, Laura mentioned aha moments earlier. I had a lot of aha moments hearing from my Black colleagues and the discrimination and the implicit biases and things that they had faced that really helped to, and I continue to be educated, certainly. But our government relations work as well. So, this is not just let's throw some money at something, because it's not. We want to make sure that we're able to grant, but also pair volunteers with it, and then look at it holistically and how TI is approaching this entire work. So shortly after those conversations began, after May 25th, the foundation, and I'm so proud of my board, they are just some awesome people, and they said, we're going to put a stake in the sand, and we're going to have racial equity as a funding focus for the TI Foundation. Now, and I can talk in a minute. I don't want to me, Erica, I'll go around the block 2 or 3 times before I get there. So I can talk later about some additional work we've done. I'll just say that racial equity as a focus area was certainly new, but if we take a look back at kind of some of the things we've done, some of that work was there. We just weren't talking about it very explicitly. So that's where we got to. We announced an initial $1 million commitment there. It's now, as Jerry mentioned, it's on our website. It's in the budget, and we're really pleased to have made our first grant in this area to Dallas TARHT.
And we're so appreciative of it. We're so appreciative of it. So you talk about your board and how proud you are of them. Talk about their journey a little bit and what they went through to get to this place. I love the stake in the sand. Was it like an immediate stake, or what was that walk to get to that stake? I
think it was pretty immediate. There was no, long drawn out consideration and things. It was fairly immediate that we said we would make that commitment and had it as a focus area. Truthfully, now Edgar, our secretary, if you're on the call, don't shoot me for this, but we really kind of went out and said we checked the board. We didn't take an official vote on it. We knew we had consensus and moved forward, and then we took the official vote later. But it was important. Things are moving very fast then. We felt we needed to get out. We needed to make a statement to the community. We needed to make a statement to our employees. We need to make a statement to other businesses that this is where the Texas Instruments Foundation and TI stands, and we needed to stand up for that. So there was no hesitation. I think, now we can talk about the process of how we found y'all, but from the time, we made that first grant in grant time fairly quick, but it was a couple of weeks, maybe 4 weeks after that initial commitment was announced, that we awarded that grant. But again, I'm very proud of them. I think one of the most, again, back to the courageous conversations, moving discussions we had was, I don't think it was that June board meeting, it might have been the one in September, but where one of our board members talked about his experience as a Black man and some of the things he had gone through. And just that Lauren talked about that, the allyship, and Diane talked about that too. Just trying to be there for him and hearing such pained experiences from one of our dear colleagues and friends that we didn't know about. We had to do something.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And I'm sure he appreciates that. So if you're advising other corporations and really taking the stand and really making sure that they're explicit around racial equity and the work that needs to be done within their organizations as well as funding, what is some guidance that you would give to them?
I think be authentic, seek counsel from employees within your organization. So we've now formed an advisory committee for our racial equity work that's made up of the executive sponsors and the co-chairs of our Black Employee Initiative. I don't certainly feel that I'm in a position of saying, here's what we should do. So bringing our employees into that conversation, listen to those voices, talk to people in the community. That's how we found y'all. We talked to folks out in the community and said who's doing good work in this area, and to almost to the person, I think the Dallas TRHT came up, and so you need to have your ear on the ground. I think also looking at what you're doing already. So, for example, I mentioned that we got much more intentional about our focus areas and calling out the racial equity work that we really have been doing. For example, in education, we have focused on Black and Latinx and marginalized populations in our education grants for many, many years, going back to the time that we did some work in pre-K in the Fraser Courts area around Fair Park, to more recently the work in Lancaster ISD. But we weren't explicit about talking about that in our language around our focus areas. We added also in the arts. We've been a funder of the arts for many, many, many years, and diversity has been a metric by which we measure our arts grants, but it's now become much more important. And I think our arts partners would tell you that when we had meetings with them back in the spring, we asked a lot more questions, and we're developing some dashboards around it to really hone in on that, and it will be a key criteria for our funding decisions going forward. Also, the ability to give transformative grants within the arts to diverse groups, so that you're not just getting a little bit here. I think as someone mentioned earlier, feel-good money, I think is what someone said. But you're really giving those groups, like we tried to do with y'all, to help transform the organization and take it to the next level. And then in our strategies, we talked about looking at things through a racial equity lens. So that's all good work and, woohoo, but we're not there yet. This is a journey. And I think funders also need to think about that. You cannot just say we're going to fund this and check it off and move on. This is something that we're committed to for the long haul. We told you and Jerry when we met with y'all that we wanted to be a long-term partner and an ongoing partner, and we have our monthly conversations and we touch base and we try to get you volunteers to help with things, and we really want it to be that genuine partnership, and from us to learn from you. So I know we have a conversation, I think, later this week about how y'all can help us look at our funding work and start that dialogue and help us to become a more racially equitable organization. So yeah, I guess at the end of the day, you've got to be authentic, talk to people in the community that you're striving to be an ally to, talk to your employees, and understand that this is long, hard work, and probably sometimes y'all are going to say things that might make us a little uncomfortable. I'm not sure if we ever talked about this or not, but Terry West, my board chair, and I certainly did. But that's okay. Sometimes you need to be uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And the last thing I'll say is that measurement. This isn't TI is a company of engineers. We love to measure everything. We need to measure everything, but this type of work is not like an education grant where you can look maybe at a STAR score or a teacher effectiveness index or an ACT or an SAT score. This is a little bit different, and we still have to work out some of this. So you have to just don't get so caught up around that kind of a metric. Look for other ways to determine the effectiveness of your grants. Have racial equity now cohorts we've talked about, Black women and nonprofit leadership cohorts, the reputation of the group, all those sorts of things.
I almost want to say, can you say that just one more time for the people in the back? It's so true when we're looking at racial equity that the traditional funding approach is that there are outcomes and there's a way to measure it all and to do all of those things. But when it comes to racial equity, it's not that simple. It is not that quantifiable. And so how do we have honest dialogue, right, with one another, which I appreciate with Texas Instruments, that we do connect monthly to have a conversation about the work that we're doing, and that you all are open-minded to the work that we're doing and what that looks like and how it might look a little different. And then also offer your expertise to us in those spaces that we might need to, think about and improve on. So I really do appreciate that conversation. So Andy, before we go, because I know that we are on a time limit with you, and I really appreciate that time, what's that one thing that you want people to take away from this conversation to help the conversation to continue?
I'm going to go back to what Jerry showed earlier on those slides, in that if you don't look at the racial equity or the race aspect of the issues we're dealing with, you're never going to solve them. And we've got a lot of inequities out there. COVID, and we knew it, but COVID showed a bright light under those inequities. And then we had the George Floyd murder and the tough conversations that we should have been having all along. We have got to continue those conversations. This work is important. If we want, and Lauren and Diane talked about it too, if we want to solve our problems, if we want to give these kids who are in school, who have been struggling so badly these last 15 months, you've got to have racial equity at the heart of those conversations. And this is important work. It's hard work, but it's work that must be done, and work that I'm so proud that my company and the foundation have signed on and are part of.
And Andy, so we are so appreciative of you and your commitment. You have a personal commitment to this that I really appreciate and value in our relationship. The way that you're leading the foundation in this work as well, and having conversation and being open to learning and walking alongside of organizations that have gone unrecognized for a period of time. And so I appreciate that. And I appreciate Texas Instruments for making racial equity not just an initiative, but a part of the fabric of the organization and really taking it through the full organization. So thank you for our conversation today. We will be in touch later this week. We do have an appointment later this week, so I'll be seeing you again. You have an amazing day. Thanks so much. And I'm going to hand it back to Jerry.
Thank you. Thank you, Erica.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Erica. Really appreciate you all sharing. A local funder's efforts to join this cause for racial equity is really important. To continue with that theme, we want to talk about what does racial equity work actually look like on the ground, and what does a funder hope to see in a racial equity collaboration between a community partner and a funder. And we'll share that by talking about a racial equity cohort, because one of our goals is to create a racial equity cohort with our funding community. So racial equity now is an idea from our early stages as an organization, to follow up from the work we've done in our community racial history, our historical analysis work, and our community visioning work. And the community voice is really important in establishing racial equity work. We talked to over 200 community members in 11 sessions over a 3-month period to hear from them on their history, a shared vision of our history, and then to envision what Dallas would look and feel like without racism. And what they shared was amazing. The most important part of that were the themes that were bubbling up, was that there needs to be an educational platform to learn about racial equity in our city, and that we need to focus on economic justice. We created the Racial Equity Now cohort, and we were blessed because at this point, and Embry can back us up, there was not a lot of steam behind racial equity funding. But the Caruth Junior Fund at the Communities Foundation of Texas gave us seed money, $305,000 at its time, one of the largest single investments in racial equity. And Embry Family Foundation collaborated with them and gave us an extra $50,000 for capacity. And we were able to bring together 16 of our largest mid-size and grassroots community members in a learning module, not for individual leaders. We have experienced, how individual leaders can go to their prospective leadership organizations or fellowships and learn some great stuff and bring it back to their organization, but it not be integrated into the organization's missions and values. But we were able to create a cohort design that was focused very intentionally on institutional racism. If you can see to the right, when we think about racism, we think about it in 4 levels, starting with the internal way that we all take in racism, but also the interpersonal. We see those things happen on a daily basis. For example, a woman calling the police on a bird watcher, right? Those are interpersonal actions, but those are not the most embedded and hard to fix. The things that funders really want to change are these systemic issues. And those systemic issues include things like institutional racism and structural racism. And the RE Now cohort design is focused on organizational impact in communities and to tackle that institutional racism that happens within organizations and the way organizations work in communities. We were able to have a great process of reaching out to the community, asking them to join us on this journey, where we were able to get grassroots organizations like the AFIA Center, mid-size organizations like Leadership ISD, and even large groups like Richardson ISD, a school district, and United Way of Dallas, and taking them on this 12-month journey with us, which turned into 18 months after the pandemic. But we were able to bring not only one member as a fellow, right, but a board member, a decision-making level staff member, and a direct level staff member in the same room receiving the same message. In cohort design that hadn't been done before, usually the direct service level staff member is not in the same room with board members. They rarely meet. And so this was an opportunity for us to change that paradigm and for other organizations to work together to talk about racial equity. We had great board members in our cohort like Ken Malcolmson, folks who were ready to share and be honest and courageous, but also to learn and to grow. The large scale objectives for our cohort was, number one, just to increase our members' knowledge of race, racism, racial healing, racial equity, and racial justice, especially with a local historical context. because it's important if you're doing local work, you have that local context because they show up in the ways that you do your work. Things like redlining, housing and educational policy, economic policy, those things have a local historical context. The next was to leave organizations with very tangible ways to do their work beyond the Racial Equity Now cohort, which included, number one, an organizational assessment to determine if they need to do internal racial equity work or external equity work. Two, a racial equity theory of change or roadmap for racial equity for their organization. Three, a racial equity policy statement, which includes the commitment that an organization makes to racial equity and the research needed to continue the work. And then a racial equity program or project to put that theory into practice. Lastly is the grant funding to implement racial equity strategy in the organization. The grant funding is really important, and I want to talk about that. But we also had additionally racial equity coaching. Each organization received a coach, which is able to give them 60+ hours of coaching about racial equity beyond the meeting times of the cohort, and also a tour. We thought it was really important to base the work that we had to do in racial equity on the actual ground of the community. The racial equity tour allowed our organizational partners to see the community, some of the unspoken or rarely spoken history in the community about racial equity. And I want to say that we've had amazing cohort partners, including organizations like the AFIA Center, Commit, American Indian Heritage Day, Bishop Arts Theater Center, Leadership ISD, City Square, Miles of Freedom, Momentous Institute, Teaching Trust, Lone Star Justice Alliance, Richardson ISD, the Bud Center at SMU, North Texas Dream Team, Interrupt, and United Way. We also have a great new cohort, including folks like BC Workshop, Dallas Mexican American League, Dallas Stars Foundation, Dallas Summer Musicals, Dallas Theater Center, the Stew Pot at First Presbyterian, Girl Scouts, KERA, Our Friends Place, Poetic, Readers to Leaders, Teach for America, the DEC Senior Source, and YMCA. And now I want to take a minute to bring one of our community partners who was a graduate of the first racial equity cohort on to talk about this aspect, because we included racial equity cohort funding as part of our grant, which means that we gave 30 to 40% of our grant right back to the community. As part of this work, we gave 14 $10,000 grants to those organizations who graduated from Racial Equity Now. So I want to bring Akila back wearing a different hat, representing Faith in Texas as Executive Director. So Akila, thank you again for joining us. I really appreciate your work in all these areas in our community in Dallas. But this time I want to talk to you as Executive Director of Faith in Texas. First, just tell us what Faith in Texas is, your mission, and the work you do, and why being part of the cohort was important for your organization.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thank you again for inviting me back. So Faith in Texas is a nonpartisan, multiracial, multi-faith-based grassroots movement of people united across values who are prioritizing, organizing work that centers racial, economic, and social justice. We work with churches, mosques, synagogues, and people who just from various faith traditions and even non-believers of any faith, but maybe spirituality, and centering our stories and experiences and our voice to ultimately impact and shape local and statewide policy here in the state of Texas. And so with our work, we directly center those most impacted by systems of mass incarceration, by the immigration system, by inequities in economics here in this country. And so racial equity for us was a key driver to our founding, who we are and who we proclaim to want to be, and who we want to live it, right? In the same ways that, you know, the Embry Family Foundation and TI and so many others, you know, have committed to centering race, want to. And so being able to participate in the inaugural racial equity now cohort was really important for us, because we were still the organization, we just celebrated 6 years. And so we're still fairly new. We're still in our beginning stages. And what was important for me and us applying, and I'm grateful that we were accepted, was that we not only think about the ways in which race is assessed in our organizing work, the policy priorities that we identified, the issues that we identified and wanted to be advocates and a voice for, but also the internal making of the organization as the executive director. Having the opportunity to participate in developing a racial equity theory of change and really thinking through that. And then ultimately coming up with our racial equity policy statement. I think that's really important because for us, it meant that it was written. It was a standard from which we were to continue to work from, not just a statement that is just out here for like branding purposes. It truly was to embody the fiber of our work. And so through the policy statement, our staff really wrestled with and making sure that we had clear language around how racial equity was brought into all of our decision-making processes, which is including our hiring practices. For me, looking at the assessment of employee salaries and ensuring that there's equity, volunteer engagement. What does that look like for an organization in the ways that we have wonderful, you know, well-meaning progressive white folks who want to engage with us, but we also have formerly incarcerated Black and Brown people, and how do we make sure the decision-making is equitable, or really that we elevate the voices and experience of those who come from our most oppressed communities. And then ultimately, as a decision maker and thinking about our programming, right? You know, as I'm soliciting funding from foundations and institutions who do grant making, you know, I really was moving away from restricted funding, because what I saw was that there was inequities in my ability to access funding for, say, criminal justice work that centered more Black bodies versus my ability to access funding for immigration work that centered our mixed status families and predominantly undocumented and or Spanish speaking and immigrant communities. So participating in the cohort was very important to us. It was needed, it was necessary for us to get on the, make sure that we were on the right path and that we were living what we were calling elected officials to uphold, what we were calling, you know, politicians, corporations, and others to do. We wanted to make sure that we were doing that as well. And as well as we were able to learn from many other local organizations and some who have been doing incredible work for many years, decades, who don't get the same level in platform and acknowledgement of their contributions to moving racial equity in this city. So it was, I was able to learn a lot through the cohort, and extremely grateful. But ultimately the $10,000 was really important, because for many folks, especially, you know, in the last year or so, everybody wants you to be in somebody's cohort or peer groups and all these working sessions, which is great and is beneficial, but also that takes up time for us, taken away from our day-to-day work to be in these spaces. It's meaningful as it is, and incredible that it is part of your professional development. Ultimately, if a check isn't aligned with it, that is contributing to the inequities within philanthropy, that we show up with our pain, our trauma, our, you know, experiences, and lay all this out for others to learn and come up with data and research with. But then ultimately we're left with still having to get out here on the front lines and trying to, you know, scrape by with minimal dollars because of, again, the racial inequities in giving that shows up.
You actually answered my second and last question. So I want to say, do you have, in 1 minute, anything to add to the necessity of funding racial equity work?
Yeah, absolutely, do it. So I just want to say, do it. And also increase your giving. I experienced taken over a white-led organization, and we had some pretty sizable foundations who had given nearly $1 million to the organization off of the hopes and dreams and idea and analysis of this white woman who I deeply admire and respect. However, when I became the ED, the risk began to go away. They weren't as willing to invest at that level with me. And I had one particular funder who started off with nearly $1 million to seed the organization. And by the time I became the ED, they had reduced their contributions to us by 75%, and then ultimately went down to $0. That is a problem. So for me, I invite the funding community, individuals as well. I don't want them to feel as though this is just about institutional giving. This is about individual giving as well. And the way that we are looking at the percentage of our giving and ensuring that it is equitable and that it is representative in how we are supporting Black and Brown leadership, voices, and experience, and not just the clients that are being served. Support our leadership, take a risk on us, and write big checks.
Thank you so much, Akita. Really appreciate you, and hope to see you very soon. Continuing on with Akila's call to the funding community, I want to bring my partner, Erica Flip-Moultrie, back to give a call to action to making racial equity a focus area, a pillar for your funding. So Erica?
Thanks, Jerry. It's kind of hard to follow Akila, right? Big checks, right? Yes, we need to do that. But this has been a great conversation, but we don't want this to end with just a conversation. We don't want this to end with just dialogue with those organizations that are doing the work currently and have been doing the work. We want to continue to have dialogue with the funding community, with individuals, as Akila said, about the imperative of racial equity funding. As a part of our mission, we actually went back and forth on including the word radical in the work that we're doing. There were people who were uncomfortable with it. There were people who were like, doesn't that have a violent tendency? And the answer is no. It really is about being intentional. It's about using influence. It's about not stepping back and being apologetic about the work that is going to be done, that is necessary. And so we want to charge everybody up to be radical in the way that they're approaching the funding of racial equity within the community. Going back to the McKinsey recommendations that Jerry went over around reducing the burden, yes, most definitely, investing local. And I really want to highlight the piece around really looking at those organizations that are led by people of color. Don't run away, don't walk away, come and have conversation and dialogue. Come and learn the story and the history. Come to understand the work that's being done. Come to understand community and what's happening with that community. Come into relationship. Racial equity work is about relationship, and we want to have those relationships. Open the doors, right? There's this feeling sometimes out there that having a conversation with the funder, you have to be invited in. Stop doing that. Walk out of your walls, walk out into the community, come and learn about the community, and then have a conversation around how can we support what the community needs. It needs to be community informed. It needs to be community driven. We need to be walking into those spaces to understand what that community needs and then funding them in a space that is transformational. We need to move away from the fact that people have been giving smaller grant dollars in the space of racial equity because we don't understand. Come to understand, and then come to make transformation within those communities. And we also want to make sure that we're accelerating that funding, absolutely. And the way that you're requesting information back from those organizations, start to move around a little bit like Texas Instruments talked about, to say racial equity is a little different. How can we make those changes, right? And so it's really imperative. It is imperative that we come into relationship and learn to have these conversations with one another. And if you don't know the answer, ask. Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation is here to provide you with those connections if you need them. If you don't know where to go, seek it out. But I guarantee you know where it is. It's just time for you to start having those conversations. So we really want to invite all of the funding community to take this conversation deeper. Don't stop. This is not the time for us to stop having this conversation. It really is the time for us to keep moving forward. So Jerry, this has been a great conversation. I'm really excited about where we're going to be going when it comes to funding racial equity, and really want to encourage people to seek out Dallas Truth Racial Healing and Transformation where they need support in being able to move their efforts forward when it comes to racial equity funding. And I think we're going to open it up to any Q&A that might have come in through our Facebook Live.
Yeah, as we wait for those questions, I want to say that if you have any additional questions or you want to ask us some questions directly, please reach out to us at our website. I also want to give a next step. So we want you to hold the date, October 12th, 2021, for a Racial Equity Now for Philanthropy Workshop. So hold that date. We will be in person for this, socially distant still, but we will be in person where we invite you all to a workshop to hear what you need to learn about racial equity and to develop a Racial Equity Now cohort for philanthropy. We also want to say thank you to those individual donors, as Akila mentioned. During this last year, we've had individual donors give money that they didn't have. We heard comments that said, you know, this is for Botham John. I'm giving a donation for Tay Jefferson. Giving a donation for the work that has to be done, or for my children. Really amazing comments and donations from individual people. So those are really important to us, and we don't take those lightly. And we do that work in your name. We really appreciate you. We also want to thank our funding partners, the funders who have also given already to racial equity in our community, including the Rainwater Charitable Foundation, which has given probably the most sizable donation in Dallas-Fort Worth towards racial equity to Dallas TRHT. The Communities Foundation of Texas, our community partner, the Meadows Foundation, Lyda Hill, of course, Embry Family Foundation, the North Texas Community Foundation, the Boone Family Foundation, United Way of Metropolitan Dallas, our initial funder, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, Texas Instruments Foundation, and the Dallas Foundation. We really appreciate you all. And then again, to our community partners for funding racial equity, Faith in Texas, Embry Family Foundation, Heritage Giving Fund, and Texas Instruments Foundation. Thank you for your work. We really appreciate you. If you have any questions, please send it to DallasTRHT.org. Check out our website. We have tons of resources for you there. Follow us on social media. We'll share more of the work that we're doing. I want to thank Diane, Lauren, Akila, Andy, and all of the staff at Dallas TRHT behind the scenes, Stephanie, Imani, Marta, and also Sally too. Thank you, Sally, for being here. We appreciate you. This concludes funding racial equity work. Thank you, Erica, for that call to action. And we will be in touch with you all. Thank you so much.